Dr. Naomi Hayes, a highly accomplished black neurosurgeon, becomes the target of racial profiling during a routine traffic stop, where Sheriff Barnes and Officer Daniels abuse their authority under the guise of routine procedure. What begins as an unwarranted search escalates into an infuriating display of condescension, systemic bias, and intimidation. Despite her calm demeanor and professional standing, Naomi faces suspicion and hostility rooted in prejudice. As her story unfolds, it reveals a disturbing pattern of misconduct within the department, forcing the audience to confront the unsettling reality of power unchecked and the persistent racial injustice embedded in the system. It was supposed to be an ordinary walk home, the kind he'd taken 100 times before. The late afternoon sun stretched shadows long across the pavement, painting the streets in hues of gold and amber. Daniel adjusted his backpack, the familiar weight of textbooks pressing against his shoulders as he took the shortcut through the park, a quiet path framed by oak trees whose branches swayed in the breeze. His mind was preoccupied with thoughts of his upcoming exams. As a college sophomore on a scholarship, Daniel had little room for error. Each grade felt like a stepping stone or a pitfall, his future teetering precariously between hope and uncertainty. He didn't notice the wallet lying on the ground until his shoe brushed against it. He stopped, his gaze drawn to the worn leather object. Picking it up, he hesitated, glancing around as if expecting someone to step forward and claim it. The park was empty except for the distant sounds of children playing near the swings. Opening the wallet, Daniel was struck by the contents. A thick stack of $100 bills that seemed out of place against the faded ID card tucked inside. The ID bore the name Andrew Coleman, along with a photograph of a stern-looking man in his 40s. Beside the cash were credit cards and a folded note with an address scribbled hastily in blue ink. Daniel's fingers hovered over the money, his heart pounding. He couldn't help but think of his tuition, the part-time job that barely covered his rent, the meals he'd skipped to make ends meet. For a moment, the temptation was deafening. But then his mother's voice echoed in his mind. Integrity isn't just what you do when people are watching. It's what you do when no one is. With a deep breath, he made his decision. What Daniel didn't know was that returning the wallet would set off a chain of events that would challenge everything he believed about honesty, privilege, and the unseen battles people carry. And it would reveal just how much a single act of kindness could ripple through lives in ways he never expected. The diner was unassuming, tucked between a laundromat and a hardware store on the edge of a sleepy town. Its chipped red and white awning flapped in the wind, barely noticeable against the backdrop of towering oaks and cracked sidewalks. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of coffee, bacon, and conversation, a haven for truckers, retirees, and teenagers sneaking milkshakes after school. Dr. Naomi Hayes, one of the country's most sought-after neurosurgeons, sat quietly at a corner booth, her presence blending seamlessly with the modest surroundings. Dressed in dark jeans, a simple cardigan, and sneakers, she looked more like a weary traveler than a woman whose hands had saved hundreds of lives. Her polished leather briefcase, a gift from a grateful patient, rested by her side, its contents unnoticed in this unpretentious setting. Naomi had come to this diner for 2 reasons. First, it was one of the few places open late on the winding road back to her estate after a week of grueling surgeries. Second, it reminded her of the diners she frequented in her childhood, places where her mother worked double shifts as a waitress to keep food on the table. The waitress approached, a teenage girl with freckles and a ponytail that swung with her steps. She looked up from her notepad, her expression friendly but distracted. "What'll it be tonight?" Naomi smiled warmly. "Just a black coffee and the apple pie, please." "Coming right up." The girl scribbled the order without a second glance, not noticing Naomi's soft-spoken gratitude. Naomi didn't mind. It wasn't the first time she'd gone unnoticed, and she suspected it wouldn't be the last. People rarely looked past what they expected to see, and her unassuming demeanor invited assumptions. That she was ordinary, that she didn't command operating rooms or sit on boards deciding the future of healthcare. Her phone buzzed on the table, vibrating against the salt shaker. She glanced at it, briefly catching the subject line of an email from her hospital's board. Upcoming budget review. Keynotes. She resisted the urge to open it. Tonight was not for budgets or administrative red tape. Tonight was for quiet reflection. The bell over the diner door jingled, and Naomi instinctively glanced up. Two men walked in, their boots heavy on the tiled floor. They wore denim jackets and baseball caps, their voices loud and tinged with the drawl of locals who knew everyone in town. Naomi didn't recognize them. They didn't look her way. The waitress returned with her coffee and pie, setting them down with a practiced efficiency. Anything else? No, this is perfect. Thank you, Naomi said. As she took a sip of coffee, her thoughts drifted. She'd just come from a successful but emotionally draining case. A 10-year-old boy with a brain tumor. The surgery had gone better than expected, but the weight of his family's anxiety still clung to her. She'd seen it in their tearful eyes as she delivered the good news. Gratitude, yes, but also exhaustion. Naomi had been there before, watching her own mother juggle bills and emotions, fighting battles that seemed endless. Her reverie was broken by the two men at the counter. Their conversation had grown louder, their laughter raucous. One of them glanced her way, his eyes narrowing slightly before he turned back to his companion. Naomi didn't flinch. She'd faced worse than a curious stare. Who's she supposed to be? The man muttered, his voice carrying across the quiet diner. Looks out of place, don't she? Probably passing through, the other replied, shrugging. Rich folks do that. Come in, act like they belong. Naomi kept her gaze on her pie, her fork slicing neatly into the golden crust. She was used to assumptions. In some circles, her success was celebrated. In others, it was met with suspicion, as if she'd taken a shortcut where none existed. It didn't bother her as much as it used to. People saw what they wanted to see. Evening, folks. The diner owner, a stout man with a salt and pepper mustache, emerged from the back. He greeted the two men warmly, then turned his attention to Naomi. His smile faltered slightly, his tone shifting. Can I help you with anything, miss? No, thank you, Naomi said evenly. I'm all set. The man hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether to leave her alone. Naomi recognized the look. One part curiosity, 2 parts hesitation. It was the look of someone trying to place her, trying to determine whether she was friend or foe. One of the men at the counter chuckled. Bet she's one of them lawyers or something. Too fancy for this place. Naomi's lips twitched into a faint smile. They weren't entirely wrong, though her line of work had nothing to do with lawsuits or courtrooms. She'd been mistaken for all sorts of things over the years. An assistant, a PR executive, once even a reporter. Surgeon rarely made the list. The waitress returned, refilling Naomi's coffee without a word. As she walked away, Naomi noticed the men watching her again. This time, their glances lingered longer, the curiosity in their eyes giving way to something harder to name. She couldn't quite place it, doubt. Resentment? Hostility? The diner's door jingled again, this time admitting a tall man in a sheriff's uniform. He surveyed the room with the practiced gaze of someone who knew how to read a room in seconds. His eyes landed on Naomi briefly before moving on, a flicker of interest sparking in his expression. He walked over to the counter, clapping one of the men on the back. Jim, how's it going tonight? The conversation shifted. The men greeted the sheriff with familiarity, their tones lightening. Naomi turned her attention back to her coffee, her mind already drifting to the drive ahead. But the sheriff's voice interrupted her thoughts. Don't think I've seen you here before, ma'am. You from around here? Naomi looked up, meeting his gaze. His expression was polite but guarded, the kind of wariness she'd come to expect in unfamiliar places. Just passing through, she replied. Stop for coffee. He nodded slowly, his eyes studying her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he turned back to the counter, but not before Naomi caught the faintest trace of skepticism in his expression. It wasn't overt, but it was there, a question unspoken, a judgment unmade. Naomi finished her pie and signaled for the check. As she reached for her wallet, she heard the sheriff ask the men something that made her pause. She giving you any trouble? The words hung in the air, heavy and charged. Naomi's hand froze mid-motion, her breath catching. The question was casual, almost too casual, but the implications were anything but. She waited, her fingers tightening around her wallet, as one of the men replied, "Nah, just sitting there, quiet as a mouse." The sheriff grunted, his tone neutral. "Good. Let's keep it that way." Naomi placed a few bills on the table, her movements calm but deliberate. As she stood, she felt the weight of their eyes on her, curious, skeptical, dismissive. She met none of their gazes directly, but she didn't hurry either. Her steps were measured, her posture relaxed. Outside, the night was cool and still. Naomi exhaled, letting the tension slip from her shoulders as she walked to her car. The encounter wasn't new. It was a story she'd lived in variations her entire life. But it was a reminder, sharp and unyielding, of the unspoken barriers she navigated every day. As she drove away, her mind turned over the sheriff's words, the way they'd been delivered with such casual authority. She'd encountered men like him before, men who measured others against an invisible scale, deciding who fit and who didn't. She glanced at her briefcase in the passenger seat, its contents a quiet testament to her achievements. A soft chuckle escaped her lips as she thought of the irony. The men in that diner had no idea who she was, no idea that the woman they'd sized up so easily held lives in her hands every day. And perhaps, she mused, that was just as well. The next town on Naomi's route was small enough to miss if one blinked, its main street dotted with antique shops and a solitary pharmacy. It was nearing 10 p.m. when Naomi's car rolled to a stop at a convenience store with a flickering neon open sign. She needed a drink for the road, something to keep her alert for the final stretch home. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale, unforgiving glow over rows of chips and soda. Naomi picked up a bottle of water and approached the counter, her footsteps muted against the linoleum. The cashier, a wiry man with thinning hair, barely glanced up from his phone as she placed her item on the counter. "That'll be $1.75, he said, his tone bored. He still hadn't looked up. Naomi pulled a $5 bill from her wallet and slid it across the counter. As the man reached for the register, the doorbell jingled. 2 police officers entered the store, their voices loud and jovial as they greeted the cashier by name. "Evening, Carl," one of them said, tipping his hat. He was stocky, with a ruddy face and an easy demeanor. His partner, younger and wiry, nodded curtly and grabbed a coffee from the dispenser near the door. Naomi's transaction was nearly complete when the younger officer glanced in her direction. His gaze lingered, narrowing slightly. "You just passing through, ma'am?" he asked, his tone polite but laced with an edge of suspicion. Naomi turned to him, offering a measured smile. "Yes, officer. Just stopped for some water." The older officer, whose badge read Sheriff Barnes, joined the conversation. "Haven't seen you around these parts before. Where are you headed?" "Home," Naomi replied simply, her voice calm. She wasn't about to volunteer details, knowing from experience how quickly a seemingly casual interaction could shift. The sheriff's eyes flicked to her briefcase, which she now held by her side. "Busy traveler," he remarked, his tone light but probing. "What line of work you in?" "Medicine," Naomi said. It wasn't a lie, but she deliberately left it vague. She didn't need to explain herself to men who hadn't even introduced themselves yet. The younger officer's lips twitched into something resembling a smirk. "Medicine, huh? You a nurse or something?" Naomi's smile faltered slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I'm a surgeon." The older officer raised an eyebrow, his expression briefly betraying surprise. "A surgeon? Around here?" "No," she replied. "I work in the city." "Well," the younger one said, chuckling under his breath, "that's fancy. Can't say we get many surgeons passing through this late at night." Naomi tightened her grip on the briefcase. Their words weren't openly hostile, but she recognized the undertones. She'd encountered them countless times before: disbelief, skepticism, the unspoken question. "Who do you think you are?" She turned back to the counter, where the cashier handed her change. "Thanks," she said, pocketing the coins and preparing to leave. But as she stepped toward the door, the sheriff's voice stopped her. "Hold on a second." Naomi paused, her heart sinking. She turned slowly, her expression neutral. Yes. The sheriff gestured toward her car, visible through the glass doors. That your vehicle out front? Yes, she said again. His friendly demeanor had shifted ever so slightly, replaced by something more authoritative. Mind if we take a look inside? Naomi's chest tightened, but she kept her tone even. Is there a reason for that request, Sheriff? Routine check, he said casually. We've had some break-ins around here lately. Just want to make sure everything's on the up and up. Her instincts screamed at her. She knew this wasn't routine. This was an excuse. She took a breath, forcing herself to stay composed. I don't believe I've done anything to warrant a search of my car. The younger officer stepped closer, his hand resting on the hilt of his holstered weapon. You refusing a lawful request, ma'am? Naomi's pulse quickened. She met his gaze squarely, her voice firm but calm. No, I'm simply asking for clarification. Am I being accused of something? The sheriff held up a placating hand. No need to get defensive. Just asking for cooperation here. Cooperation for what? Naomi pressed. I stopped for water. Paid for it. That's all. The room seemed to shrink as tension filled the space. Carl, the cashier, suddenly found something interesting on the floor, avoiding her gaze. The younger officer's smirk returned, his eyes flicking over her with a mix of amusement and condescension. Why don't we step outside and talk this over? The sheriff suggested, his tone firm. Naomi hesitated, every fiber of her being told her this was a power play, a test to see how far they could push her. But she also knew resisting outright could escalate the situation dangerously. She nodded once, her movements measured, and followed them outside. The cool night air did little to ease the tightness in her chest as she stood by her car. The sheriff gestured toward the passenger side door. If you could open it up for us, we'll be quick. Naomi set her briefcase on the roof of the car and retrieved her keys. As she unlocked the door, she asked, Are you documenting this search? The sheriff frowned slightly. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'd like a record of what's happening here, Naomi said, her voice steady. For transparency. The younger officer snorted. Transparency. Lady, you got something to hide? No, Naomi said coolly. But I believe everyone benefits from accountability, don't you? The sheriff's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Naomi opened the car door and stepped back, crossing her arms as the two officers peered inside. Her car was immaculate, the seats pristine, and the only items visible were a travel mug and a folded sweater on the back seat. Still, the younger officer rummaged through the glove compartment and under the seats, his movements deliberate. Nothing here, he said after a few minutes, his tone almost disappointed. Looks clean, the sheriff agreed, closing the door with a soft thud. He turned to Naomi, his expression unreadable. Thanks for your cooperation. Naomi felt a flicker of relief, but it was quickly replaced by frustration. May I ask why you felt this was necessary? The sheriff shrugged, his tone dismissive. Just doing our job, the younger officer added with a smirk. You can never be too careful these days. Naomi didn't respond. Instead, she retrieved her briefcase from the roof, opened the car door, and slid into the driver's seat. She shut the door with deliberate calm and started the engine, her hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. As she pulled out of the lot, she glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the two officers disappear into the neon-lit store. The anger hit her in waves as she drove. It wasn't just the inconvenience of the search. It was the way they'd looked at her, spoken to her, dismissed her. They hadn't seen a surgeon, a woman who'd spent years honing her craft to save lives. They'd seen someone who didn't belong, a black woman in a nice car, alone at night. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. You have to be twice as good, Naomi. Twice as smart, twice as calm. They'll still doubt you, but you'll know your worth. She breathed deeply, forcing the anger down. She couldn't let it consume her, not now. There were bigger battles to fight, and she needed her composure intact for what lay ahead. The narrow road was lined with dense trees, their branches stretching toward the darkened sky like skeletal fingers. Naomi had barely driven 5 miles from the convenience store when she noticed the flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Her stomach clenched as the siren's wail pierced the stillness of the night. She pulled over, the gravel crunching beneath her tires. Turning off the engine, she rested her hands on the steering wheel and took a deep breath. This wasn't her first time being pulled over, but it never got easier. The memory of her mother's voice played in her mind again. Stay calm, Naomi. Stay respectful. Don't give them a reason. A car door slammed behind her, and moments later, the sheriff's familiar frame filled her side mirror. His flashlight beamed through the driver's side window, illuminating her face. He gestured for her to lower the window. Evening again, ma'am, Sheriff Barnes said, his tone unreadable. License and registration. Naomi complied without hesitation, retrieving the documents from her glove compartment. She handed them over, her expression neutral. Is there a problem, Sheriff? He inspected her license, his flashlight hovering over the details. You came through that stop sign back there a little fast. Naomi frowned. She hadn't run any stop signs. She was meticulous about her driving, especially in unfamiliar areas. I'm sure I stopped, Sheriff, she said, keeping her voice steady. The sheriff's lips curved into a tight smile. You sure about that? My partner saw you roll through. Naomi clenched her teeth, but said nothing. She knew arguing wouldn't help. Instead, she watched as the sheriff took a step back, waving over his younger partner, Officer Daniels, who had just arrived in a second patrol car. Daniels approached with a swagger, his smirk already in place. What do we have here? Daniels drawled, leaning slightly to peer inside the car. His eyes flicked to Naomi's briefcase in the passenger seat. That looks important. What's in there? Documents, Naomi replied curtly. Is there a reason you're asking? Daniels chuckled, shaking his head. Just curious. You seemed pretty eager to leave earlier. Mind if we take another look? Naomi stiffened. Sheriff, I've already been searched once tonight. Is this necessary? Barnes stepped closer, his expression hardening. You in a hurry to get somewhere, ma'am? Because you're acting real nervous. Nervous? The word grated against her. It was the same weaponized language she'd heard before, an accusation disguised as an observation, a subtle way of painting her as guilty without evidence. I'm not nervous, Sheriff, Naomi said, her voice firm but calm. I just don't see why this is escalating. Barnes exchanged a glance with Daniels, who opened his mouth to speak but was interrupted by a third figure approaching, Deputy Mitchell. Naomi recognized him from earlier, standing behind the counter at the convenience store. His arrival was unexpected, but his expression was different from the others. Unsure, almost reluctant. What's going on here? Mitchell asked, his voice tinged with hesitation. Traffic stop, Daniels said breezily. She ran a sign. Mitchell frowned, his gaze shifting to Naomi. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and she saw something flicker there, doubt. Concern. He looked back at Barnes. Did you get it on camera? The sheriff's jaw tightened. We don't need a camera, Mitchell. We saw it. Naomi decided to speak up. Deputy, I'd appreciate your objectivity here. I believe I stopped, and I don't think a second search of my car is warranted. Mitchell hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Sheriff, maybe we should just issue the ticket and let her go. No need to drag this out. Daniel scoffed. What's the rush? She's got time, and I think it'd be a good idea to check that briefcase. Something doesn't sit right. Naomi felt her pulse quicken. She turned to Mitchell, appealing to his humanity. Deputy, I've been cooperative. I've done nothing wrong. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between Naomi and the others. Sheriff. Enough, Barnes snapped, cutting him off. Step back, Mitchell. I'll handle this. Daniel smirked, clearly enjoying the power play, and opened Naomi's car door without waiting for permission. Let's see what's so important. Naomi's calm demeanor cracked slightly. That's private property. You have no right. Ma'am, Barnes interrupted, his voice cold. If you resist, this will only get worse for you. Naomi's heart pounded as Daniels reached for the briefcase. She wanted to yell, to scream, to stop this invasion of her privacy. Instead, she clenched her fists, watching helplessly as he unzipped it and rifled through its contents. Inside were precisely what she'd said: medical documents, patient files, and notes for an upcoming presentation. Daniels pulled out a folder, flipping it open and scanning its contents with exaggerated interest. Well, he said mockingly. What do we have here? Some kind of secret? Naomi's jaw tightened. Those are confidential. Put them back. Confidential, huh? Daniels grinned, handing the folder to Barnes. Your turn, Sheriff. Barnes flipped through the papers, his brow furrowing as he skimmed medical jargon and diagrams. You're a doctor? He asked finally, his tone incredulous. A surgeon, Naomi corrected, her voice icy. The sheriff looked at her, clearly taken aback. For a moment, he seemed uncertain, as if re-evaluating his assumptions. But the hesitation passed quickly, replaced by a defensive glare. Why didn't you just say that earlier? I didn't realize I needed to, Naomi shot back. Her composure was slipping, frustration bubbling to the surface. Being a surgeon doesn't exempt me from my rights as a citizen. Daniels chuckled, closing the briefcase with a snap. You've got quite the attitude for someone pulled over for a simple ticket. Naomi met his gaze head-on, her voice sharp. And you've got quite the audacity for someone abusing their authority. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Barnes's face darkened, and Danielle's smirk vanished. For a brief moment, silence reigned, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the trees. Ma'am, Barnes said finally, his voice low and dangerous, you're this close to making a big mistake. Before Naomi could respond, Mitchell stepped forward again, his voice cutting through the tension. Sheriff, this has gone far enough. Barnes turned on him, his face a mask of fury. You questioning me, Mitchell? I'm saying this isn't right, Mitchell replied, his voice firm despite his obvious unease. She hasn't done anything to justify this. Let's write the ticket and move on. Barnes stared at him for a long moment, his eyes blazing. Then he threw the folder back into the briefcase and slammed the car door shut. Fine, he spat. Ticket her. Daniels looked like he wanted to argue, but Barnes shot him a look that silenced him. Mitchell stepped forward, pulling out his notepad and pen. His hands trembled slightly as he wrote, tearing off the slip and handing it to Naomi. I'm sorry about this, he murmured, barely audible. Naomi took the ticket, her hand brushing his briefly. Thank you, Deputy, she said, her voice quiet but laced with meaning. Barnes and Daniels returned to their cars without another word. Mitchell lingered for a moment, meeting Naomi's gaze again before turning away. As the patrol cars disappeared into the night, Naomi sat in her vehicle, her hands gripping the steering wheel. Her chest heaved with suppressed anger, her mind racing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder, and she glanced at the screen. A text from a colleague. Let me know if you made it home safe. Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. She texted back a simple, not yet. Then she started her engine and drove, her resolve hardening with each passing mile. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who'd faced this kind of treatment, every time someone's dignity had been stripped away by those who were supposed to protect them. The wheels in her mind turned, formulating a plan. She would not let this slide. By the time she reached her driveway, the anger had transformed into something sharper, determination. Naomi Hayes had spent her life fighting battles in the operating room, saving lives against impossible odds. This was just another battle, and she intended to win. Naomi's breath came in shallow, measured draws as she parked her car in the driveway of her estate. The comforting sight of her sprawling home, tucked away from the chaos of the city, did little to soothe her nerves. Instead, it magnified her frustration. Her sanctuary had been invaded, not physically, but in spirit. The events of the night replayed in her mind on an endless loop. The smirks, the accusations, the sheer audacity of Daniels and Barnes. She stepped out of her car, the night air cool against her skin, and grabbed her briefcase from the passenger seat. Her hands still trembled with residual anger. As she approached the door, her phone buzzed again. She unlocked it, finding another text from her hospital's board chair, Dr. Caroline Banks. Call me ASP. Important. Naomi's fingers hovered over the screen before she dialed. Banks answered on the second ring, her voice tight with urgency. Naomi, thank God you called. We got a situation. What's wrong? Naomi asked, her professional instincts kicking in. Banks sighed. It's not medical. It's PR. Someone leaked footage of an incident involving you tonight. Naomi's heart skipped a beat. Footage? What footage? A bystander recorded the sheriff's traffic stop, Banks said. It's all over social media. People are already asking questions. Naomi's stomach churned. What does the video show? Banks hesitated. Enough to stir outrage. You were calm and cooperative, but the officers, they didn't come across well. It's already sparked debate. Some supportive, others calling it a misunderstanding. Naomi exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of her nose. She'd spent her career avoiding scandals, navigating a system that often demanded perfection from her while excusing mediocrity in others. Now, she was thrust into the center of one. I didn't provoke them, Naomi said, her voice steady but low. They stopped me without cause and escalated things unnecessarily. I believe you, Banks replied. But we need to get ahead of this. The hospital can't afford a PR nightmare, and neither can you. The board is already talking damage control. Naomi's jaw tightened. Damage control for what? I didn't do anything wrong. I know, Banks said. But public perception is everything. Let's strategize in the morning. Naomi ended the call and stood in her foyer, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She dropped her briefcase onto a nearby table and sank into a chair. Her mind raced with possibilities, ways to control the narrative, to ensure the truth wasn't drowned out by spin and bias. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was an unknown number. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but something urged her to answer. Dr. Hayes, she said cautiously. A man's voice came through the line, low and hesitant. Dr. Hayes, this is Deputy Mitchell. Naomi straightened. Deputy, what can I do for you? There was a pause. I wanted to apologize for earlier. What happened wasn't right, and he hesitated, his voice faltering. I thought you should know. There's more going on here than just a bad traffic stop. Naomi's grip on the phone tightened. What do you mean? Mitchell sighed. Barnes and Daniels, they've been under scrutiny before. Complaints, internal investigations, you name it. But nothing ever sticks. The system protects them. Naomi's pulse quickened. And you're telling me this because? Because they're going to try and discredit you, Mitchell said. Barnes is already talking about filing a report against you. Claims you were combative. They want to make this go away by making you the problem. Naomi closed her eyes, willing herself to stay calm. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm tired of watching it happen, Mitchell said, his voice firm now. You didn't deserve what happened tonight, and people need to know the truth. Naomi considered his words, the implications swirling in her mind. Mitchell was risking a lot by reaching out to her. His job, his reputation. It spoke volumes about his character, but it also confirmed what she already suspected. This wasn't just a bad night. This was part of something larger, something systemic. Thank you for telling me, Naomi said finally. But I'll need more than words to stop them. I have records, Mitchell said quickly. Incidents that were buried. I can get you evidence, but I need to be careful. If they find out I'm talking to you. They won't, Naomi assured him. Send me what you can. And Mitchell. Yes. Be careful. The following morning, Naomi sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through her phone as the sunlight streamed through the windows. The video had gone viral overnight. The hashtags #Justice for Naomi and #accountability trending on multiple platforms. Comments ranged from outrage to dismissal, the usual mix of support and skepticism. Her email dinged. It was from Mitchell, containing several attachments. She opened the first, a scan of a complaint filed against Barnes 2 years prior. The details were chilling. An account of intimidation and excessive force eerily similar to her own experience. The complaint had been dismissed, citing lack of evidence. The second document was a log of internal investigations involving Daniels. Most were closed without resolution, but the patterns were clear. Repeated accusations of misconduct, all swept under the rug. Naomi's jaw tightened as she read, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the countless others who had been silenced, dismissed, or ignored. She couldn't let it continue. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from her attorney, Marcus Reed. She'd contacted him late the previous night, knowing she needed someone who could navigate the legal and media storm brewing around her. Naomi, Marcus said, his voice steady. I've seen the video and the documents you forwarded. We have a case. A case for what? She asked. Civil rights violations, Marcus replied. Unlawful search, harassment, abuse of authority. And with the evidence from Mitchell, we can show this isn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern. Naomi exhaled slowly. What's the next step? First, we go public, Marcus said. A press conference. We lay out the facts, control the narrative before they can spin it. Then we file a formal complaint with the state attorney general's office. This isn't just about those two officers. It's about the system that protects them. Naomi hesitated. The idea of stepping into the spotlight, of exposing herself to further scrutiny, was daunting. But the alternative, silence, wasn't an option. Let's do it, she said, her voice firm. Later that afternoon, Naomi stood at a podium in a small conference room, the hum of reporters filling the air. Marcus stood beside her, his presence reassuring. Behind them, a projection screen displayed excerpts from the documents Mitchell had provided. Naomi adjusted the microphone, scanning the room. Cameras clicked, pens scribbled. She took a deep breath. Good afternoon, she began, her voice steady. My name is Dr. Naomi Hayes. I am a neurosurgeon, a community advocate, and like many of you, someone who believes in the rule of law. But what I experienced last night was not justice. It was an abuse of power. The room went silent as she recounted the events of the traffic stop, her words measured but pointed. She described the unwarranted search, the condescension, and the systemic failures that allowed it to happen. Then she gestured to the screen behind her, where the records of Barnes and Daniels' past misconduct were displayed. This isn't just about me, Naomi said, her voice rising. This is about a pattern of behavior, a culture of impunity that protects those who abuse their authority. It's time for accountability. A reporter raised their hand. Dr. Hayes, what do you hope to achieve with this press conference? Naomi met the reporter's gaze. I hope to shine a light on what's been hidden for too long, to ensure that no one else has to endure what I did, and to remind those in power that their actions have consequences. As the room erupted into questions, Naomi felt a surge of determination. This was the fight she hadn't chosen but couldn't walk away from, and she was ready for whatever came next. The courthouse buzzed with restrained tension. Reporters with notebooks and cameras lingered outside the building, whispering theories about the impending hearing. The public response to Naomi's press conference had been overwhelming, and the state had responded swiftly. Sheriff Barnes and Officer Daniels were summoned for a preliminary inquiry into the allegations of misconduct, with Naomi set to testify. Her evidence had been reviewed, her credibility deemed impeccable. But this was only the beginning. Naomi stood in the hallway, her tailored black blazer sharp against the marble walls. Her attorney, Marcus Reed, was beside her, flipping through a folder of case notes. She tightened her grip on the briefcase in her hand, steadying herself. The stakes couldn't have been higher, not just for her, but for every person who had endured the abuses of a broken system. They'll try to discredit you, Marcus murmured, breaking her thoughts. Stay composed. You've already won the public's trust. Naomi nodded, exhaling slowly. I'm ready. The courtroom doors swung open, and the bailiff signaled them inside. Naomi strode forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. The room was modest, with rows of wooden benches and a raised bench for the presiding judge. At the defense table sat Barnes and Daniels, their expressions a mixture of defiance and discomfort. Naomi took her seat at the plaintiff's table, placing her briefcase neatly beside her. She could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't flinch. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman with graying hair, called the room to order. This preliminary hearing is to determine whether there is sufficient evidence to proceed with a formal investigation into allegations of misconduct by Sheriff Walter Barnes and Officer Jack Daniels. Dr. Naomi Hayes, you may take the stand. Naomi rose and made her way to the witness stand. She placed her hand on the Bible, swearing to tell the truth before settling into the chair. The courtroom quieted as Marcus approached. Dr. Hayes, Marcus began, his voice calm and measured. Can you recount the events of the night in question? Naomi spoke clearly, her voice steady as she described the traffic stop, the unwarranted search, and the officer's condescending behavior. She detailed the fear and frustration she'd felt, carefully avoiding any exaggeration. Marcus guided her through the testimony, presenting Mitchell's documents as evidence of a broader pattern. When Marcus finished, the defense attorney rose. He was a sharp-suited man with an air of practiced confidence, his voice smooth and calculated. "Dr. Hayes," he began, "you've described what you believe to be misconduct. But isn't it true that officers routinely perform traffic stops for public safety?" "Yes," Naomi replied, "but this stop had no basis. I was pulled over without cause." The attorney smirked. "That's your interpretation. Could it be that Sheriff Barnes and Officer Daniels were simply doing their jobs?" Naomi met his gaze evenly. If their job includes harassment and intimidation, then yes, they were. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. The attorney's smirk faltered. "Dr. Hayes, you've been portrayed in the media as a victim. But isn't it true that your actions, refusing the officer's requests, escalated the situation?" Naomi felt a flicker of anger, but kept her tone calm. "I didn't refuse. I asked for clarification. That's not escalation. That's exercising my rights." The defense attorney opened his mouth to continue, but the judge interjected. "Counsel, move on." The defense shifted tactics, calling Barnes to the stand. The sheriff spoke with the confidence of someone who believed the system would protect him. He downplayed the stop, portraying it as routine and claiming Naomi had been uncooperative. But Marcus was ready. When cross-examining Barnes, he pounced on the inconsistencies in his statements, using Mitchell's documents to expose his pattern of behavior. "Sheriff Barnes," Marcus said, his voice sharp, "how do you explain the repeated complaints against you, all with similar allegations?" Barnes shifted in his seat. "People don't like being told what to do. It comes with the job. Does it also come with abusing your authority?" Marcus pressed. "Because the evidence suggests a clear pattern." Barnes clenched his jaw, his carefully constructed facade cracking. He glanced at Daniels, who was visibly sweating, his confidence unraveling under the scrutiny. Finally, Daniels was called to the stand. His testimony was riddled with contradictions, his demeanor increasingly defensive. Naomi watched as Marcus dismantled his credibility piece by piece, laying bare the truth. The room grew tense as Marcus reached his final question. "Officer Daniels, is it true that after the stop, you instructed Deputy Mitchell to destroy his notes about the incident?" Daniels froze. His gaze darted to Barnes, whose face paled. Daniels stammered, the weight of the question pressing down on him. "I don't recall." "You don't recall," Marcus repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Or you don't want to admit it under oath?" The judge leaned forward. "Officer Daniels, answer the question." Daniels hesitated, then muttered, "I might have said something to that effect." The courtroom erupted. The judge slammed her gavel, demanding order. Naomi sat motionless, her heart pounding as the implications sank in. The cracks in their armor were widening. When the hearing resumed, the judge addressed the room. "Based on the evidence presented, I find sufficient grounds to recommend a formal investigation into the conduct of Sheriff Barnes and Officer Daniels. This court will adjourn pending further proceedings." As the gavel fell, Naomi felt a wave of relief wash over her. But the moment was short-lived. Barnes and Daniels rose from their seats, their expressions dark with fury. Barnes stalked toward Naomi as she stood. "You think you've won?" he hissed, his voice low but venomous. "This isn't over." Naomi met his glare with unwavering resolve. "No, it's not. And that's exactly why you should be worried." Naomi stepped out of the courthouse, the sunlight blinding after the dim courtroom. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions. She ignored them, her focus unyielding as she reached Marcus. "We did it," Marcus said, his voice tinged with triumph. "This is just the beginning, but it's a strong start." Naomi nodded, her mind already racing with the next steps. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. But for the first time, she felt the tide turning, and she was ready to see it through. The municipal building hummed with anticipation. Naomi stepped out of her car, the weight of the evening pressing on her shoulders. She had agreed to attend a town hall, a public meeting meant to address rising concerns about law enforcement practices following the release of her story. The video of her traffic stop had galvanized the community, and tonight, Sheriff Barnes and Officer Daniels were expected to speak. The auditorium was packed. Rows of folding chairs stretched to the back wall, where people stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices mingling in a low buzz. Reporters clustered near the front, their cameras trained on the small stage where a podium stood beneath the stark light of an overhead bulb. A banner reading Community Accountability Forum hung crookedly against the far wall. Naomi found a seat near the middle of the room, her lawyer Marcus Reed beside her. Deputy Mitchell had slipped her a note earlier in the day, warning her that Barnes was planning to set the record straight. She braced herself, knowing this confrontation would be decisive. The mayor, a stocky man with a nervous demeanor, stepped up to the podium and called the room to order. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began. "We're here to foster open dialogue and ensure transparency in the wake of recent events." Naomi folded her hands in her lap, her pulse steady. She had prepared for this moment, rehearsing her points with Marcus and reviewing the evidence Deputy Mitchell had provided. Still, the tension was palpable. Barnes was the first to speak. He strode to the podium, his uniform crisp, his expression composed but simmering with restrained anger. He adjusted the microphone and scanned the crowd, his gaze lingering on Naomi for a beat too long. "As sheriff of this town," Barnes began, his voice authoritative, "I take my responsibilities seriously. The safety of our community is my top priority. But recently, my character and my department have been called into question by baseless accusations and a one-sided narrative." Naomi's jaw tightened. Barnes leaned into his rhetoric, framing himself as a misunderstood public servant, a victim of unfair scrutiny. He spoke of his record of service and dedication to justice, drawing polite applause from a smattering of supporters in the audience. But the energy in the room shifted when Barnes turned directly to Naomi. "Dr. Hayes," he said, his voice taking on an edge, "I respect your profession and your achievements, but I can't stand by while my integrity is attacked without evidence." The audience murmured. All eyes turned to Naomi, waiting for her response. Marcus nudged her arm. "It's time," he whispered. Naomi rose, the scrape of her chair against the floor sharp in the silence. She walked to the aisle, her back straight, and approached the microphone set up for public comments. "Thank you, Sheriff Barnes," Naomi began, her voice calm but resonant. "I also respect your position, but respect doesn't exempt you from accountability." The crowd stirred. Barnes's expression hardened, his mouth set in a thin line. Naomi continued, "The evidence speaks for itself. The video of the traffic stop shows the unwarranted search of my car. Deputy Mitchell's records document a pattern of intimidation and abuse of power. And the complaints filed by other community members, dismissed, ignored, buried, paint a clear picture of systemic failure." She turned to the crowd, her gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. "This isn't about one bad night or one bad officer. It's about a culture that allows these behaviors to persist. It's about the people who suffer in silence because they think no one will believe them." A smattering of applause broke out, but Barnes cut in, his voice sharp. "With all due respect, Dr. Hayes, you're making assumptions based on incomplete information. You don't know the pressures of this job, the split-second decisions we have to make." Naomi faced him directly. "You're right, Sheriff. I don't know what it's like to wear your badge. But I do know what it's like to be profiled, to be treated as a threat when I've done nothing wrong. And I know that if people like you abuse your authority, it erodes trust for all officers." The room buzzed with tension. Barnes stepped forward, his tone defensive. "You think you can come into my town, accuse me of misconduct, and walk away unscathed? You don't understand the challenges we face. This isn't some cushy hospital in the city." Naomi's composure didn't waver. "The challenges you face don't justify the harm you've caused. And this isn't just your town, Sheriff. It belongs to everyone who lives here, everyone who deserves fairness and dignity." Barnes's mask of professionalism slipped, revealing the simmering anger beneath. "You think you're better than us, don't you? Flashing your credentials, stirring up trouble. People like you don't belong here." The room fell silent. The words hung in the air, a raw and unfiltered glimpse into his prejudice. Naomi's stomach turned, but she seized the moment. "People like me, Sheriff?" she repeated, her voice steady. "People who work hard, who fight for justice, who won't back down in the face of intimidation. If that's what you mean, then yes, I'm exactly where I belong." The crowd erupted. Voices overlapped, some shouting in support, others in defense of Barnes. The mayor pounded his gavel, struggling to regain order. Naomi held her ground, her gaze locked with Barnes. His true nature was laid bare, his authority crumbling under the weight of his own words. She turned back to the audience. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "It's about all of us, about building a community where trust isn't a luxury, where power is earned through service, not fear. Tonight, we have a choice, to stand for what's right or to let fear and prejudice win." The applause that followed was thunderous. Marcus nodded approvingly, and even the mayor seemed moved, his expression softening. Barnes, meanwhile, retreated to his seat, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Daniels avoided Naomi's gaze, his shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear. As the meeting adjourned, Naomi was swarmed by reporters and supporters, their questions and words of encouragement blurring into a whirlwind. She answered calmly, but her focus was already on the next steps. This battle wasn't over, but tonight had been a turning point. The fallout from the town hall was swift and decisive. By the next morning, Sheriff Barnes and Officer Daniels found themselves at the center of a formal investigation ordered by the State Attorney General's office. The video evidence, combined with Naomi's testimony and Deputy Mitchell's documentation, had created a tidal wave too powerful for the local government to ignore. Naomi woke early that day, her phone buzzing relentlessly with updates. Marcus had already called twice, eager to discuss the next steps. But for the first time in days, Naomi allowed herself a moment of quiet. She brewed a cup of tea and stood by her kitchen window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The peace felt unfamiliar, but welcome. Her thoughts drifted to the night before. Barnes's face, as he spat out those damning words, "People like you don't belong here," was etched into her memory. It wasn't the first time she'd faced that kind of hatred, but exposing it publicly had felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that prejudice had tried to erode. The sound of a car in the driveway broke her reverie. Marcus stepped out, briefcase in hand, and gave her a small wave. Naomi opened the door before he could knock. "Good morning," she said, gesturing for him to come in. "You're looking surprisingly calm," Marcus remarked, setting his briefcase on the counter. "Considering the storm you've stirred up." Naomi smiled faintly. "It's not my first storm. What's the latest?" "Barnes and Daniels have been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation," Marcus said. Mitchell's testimony sealed it. He handed over even more documents last night, complaints going back a decade. Naomi nodded, a quiet satisfaction settling in her chest. "And the community?" Marcus's face softened. "It's changing, Naomi. People are waking up." The town hall sparked something. Local leaders are already talking about forming a civilian oversight committee for the police department. "You made that happen." The weight of his words sank in slowly. Naomi had spent her career saving lives in operating rooms, wielding precision and intellect to fight death. But this battle, fought in public, messy and uncertain, had shown her another kind of power. The power of standing up, of refusing to stay silent. "Good," she said simply. "It's a start." Later that week, Naomi received an unexpected visitor. Deputy Mitchell stood on her porch, his hat in his hands. His shoulders were hunched, his expression a mixture of nervousness and determination. "Dr. Hayes," he began when she opened the door. "I just wanted to say thank you." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For speaking up," he said, his voice steady. "For not letting them get away with it. I've been part of this system for years, watching things I knew were wrong, but didn't have the courage to fight. You gave me the push I needed." Naomi studied him for a moment, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "It wasn't easy, was it?" she asked. "No," he admitted, "but it was necessary." She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. Over coffee, Mitchell shared more about his experiences, his struggles with loyalty, fear of retaliation, and the guilt that had built up over time. By the end of their conversation, Naomi felt a surprising sense of connection. He wasn't just an ally. He was proof that change could start from within. In the weeks that followed, the investigation uncovered a staggering amount of misconduct within the department. Barnes and Daniels were charged with multiple counts of abuse of authority, and several other officers faced disciplinary actions. The community rallied behind the push for reform, demanding transparency and accountability. Naomi became a reluctant but effective spokesperson for the movement, her story a rallying cry for justice. Despite the progress, there were moments of doubt and backlash. Anonymous threats arrived in the mail, and online trolls flooded her social media accounts with vitriol. But Naomi had long since learned to withstand the weight of others' hatred. For every negative message, there were 10 more from people thanking her for her courage, sharing their own stories of injustice. One evening, as Naomi walked through her garden, she received a call from the hospital's board chair, Dr. Banks. The board had initially worried that Naomi's public fight would tarnish the hospital's reputation, but the opposite had happened. Her integrity and resilience had inspired admiration from colleagues and patients alike. "We'd like to nominate you for a leadership position on the ethics committee," Banks said. "Your perspective is exactly what we need." Naomi hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "I'd be honored." Months later, Naomi attended a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the newly established Community Oversight Office. The event was small but meaningful, attended by local leaders, activists, and residents. Deputy Mitchell was there, standing quietly at the back, his presence a silent testament to the progress that had been made. As Naomi stood at the podium, she reflected on how far they'd come. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said, her voice steady. "And it doesn't happen because of one person. It happens when a community decides to stand together, to demand better, to refuse to accept injustice as inevitable." The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time in months, Naomi felt a sense of closure. The battle wasn't over. There would always be more work to do, more systems to challenge, but for now, she could breathe. As she stepped away from the podium, a young woman approached her, clutching a notebook. "Dr. Hayes," she said shyly, "I'm a journalism student. Your story inspired me to write about systemic issues in my hometown. I just wanted to say thank you." Naomi smiled, placing a hand on the woman's shoulder. "Keep writing," she said. "Keep shining a light." That night, Naomi returned home, exhausted but content. She sat in her favorite chair, her tea steaming beside her, and allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. The path she had walked hadn't been easy, and it never would be. But as she looked out at the stars, she felt a quiet certainty. She had done the right thing. Her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Marcus. "Got wind of another case you might want to look at. Let's talk tomorrow?" Naomi set the phone down and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fights. But tonight, she would rest, knowing she had stood her ground and won. Naomi sat in her study, the soft glow of her desk lamp illuminating the stack of letters in front of her. They were from people across the country, teachers, nurses, small business owners, students, each thanking her for her courage. Some recounted their own encounters with injustice, stories that mirrored her experience in ways that were both heartbreaking and familiar. As she read, Naomi felt a profound sense of connection. Her story, painful and exhausting as it had been, had sparked something larger than herself. In the months since the town hall and the formal investigation into Sheriff Barnes and Officer Daniels, Naomi had become a reluctant public figure. Her testimony had led to significant changes. Barnes had resigned in disgrace, Daniels had been dismissed, and the state had enacted new measures to ensure police accountability. A civilian oversight board now operated in her town, and other municipalities were following suit, inspired by the attention her case had drawn. But progress hadn't come without cost. Naomi had faced personal and professional challenges. Pushback from those who resented her for speaking out, moments of doubt about whether her actions would make a difference, and the emotional toll of reliving the trauma through interviews and public appearances. Yet through it all, she found strength in the voices of others, in the collective determination to demand better. The growth of a fighter. Naomi had always believed in the power of resilience. As a neurosurgeon, she knew what it meant to fight for life, to refuse to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. But her battle against systemic injustice had required a different kind of strength, a willingness to expose herself, to risk her reputation and safety for the sake of a cause that mattered. The experience had transformed her. It wasn't that she had been naive before, but the starkness of her confrontation with prejudice and power had deepened her resolve. She no longer saw her role as confined to the operating room. Her voice, her story, her willingness to stand up, they were as much tools for change as her scalpel. Naomi had also learned the importance of allies. Marcus, Deputy Mitchell, and even the strangers who had taken her side in the court of public opinion. They had all played critical roles in the fight. Change, she realized, was never the work of one person. It was a collective effort, born of courage and solidarity. A mirror to society. Naomi's story was not unique, and that was what made it so powerful. The events of that night on the roadside were a microcosm of broader societal issues. The systemic biases that shape perceptions, the unchecked power that allowed abuse to thrive, and the fear that silenced so many. Her confrontation with Barnes and Daniels had exposed more than their individual misconduct. It had forced the community to reckon with uncomfortable truths about authority and accountability. The town's response, a civilian oversight board, mandatory bias training for officers, and increased transparency, was a step in the right direction, but Naomi knew it wasn't enough. Real change would require sustained effort, vigilance, and a willingness to confront the roots of injustice. Her case had also ignited a national conversation. News outlets and social media users debated the implications of her story, drawing connections to similar cases across the country. Advocacy groups reached out to her, eager to amplify her voice in the fight for systemic reform. And while Naomi appreciated the attention, she also understood the danger of the spotlight. The temptation to focus on individual stories rather than the structures that enabled such abuses was strong. She resolved to use her platform to shift the narrative, to move beyond her experience and shine a light on the deeper issues at play. Hope in action. For Naomi, the greatest reward had been the letters, the emails, and the messages from people who had been inspired by her actions. A teacher in a small southern town wrote about introducing lessons on social justice to her students. A young black man from Chicago shared his story of standing up to discrimination in his workplace. A mother in California thanked Naomi for giving her the courage to file a complaint against an officer who had mistreated her son. These stories reminded Naomi why she had fought, why she continued to fight. They were proof that progress was possible, not inevitable, not easy, but achievable through persistence and courage. Her journey wasn't over. She planned to continue working with advocacy groups, speaking at events, and supporting initiatives for police reform. But she also knew the importance of balance. The fight for justice was a marathon, not a sprint, and she needed to protect her own well-being to sustain her efforts. A call to action. Naomi's story is a testament to the power of one person's voice to ignite change. But it is also a reminder that real progress requires collective action. It requires people to challenge the status quo, to demand accountability, and to stand together in the face of injustice. Her message to others was simple but profound. Speak up, even when it's hard. Stand firm, even when you feel alone. Change begins with the courage to say, "This is not right, and I will not accept it." The journey ahead. As Naomi placed the last of the letters back into their envelope, she glanced out the window. The stars were beginning to emerge, their faint light piercing the darkness. They reminded her of something her mother used to say. Even the smallest light can break through the deepest shadow. The world wasn't perfect. It likely never would be. But Naomi knew that every act of courage, every moment of resistance, every demand for accountability brought them closer to a brighter future. And she was determined to keep fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who needed a voice, a champion, a light in the darkness. As she turned off the lamp and headed to bed, Naomi felt a quiet, but unshakable certainty. This was only the beginning.